As the path to find peace in the Russia-Ukraine war continues, it's inexorable, and it's just blood difficulty in going forward, path to finding a peace. We seem to be stuck on one issue here, or maybe have arrived at one point, which is the security guarantees for Ukraine that they'll never get. And I think if you come to a recognition of where this really is, what people can and cannot do, what they can and cannot compel on their adversaries to do, I think things might get a little bit clearer. But right now, they're actually not, because things are stuck in the I guess the media frenzy of what people love to talk about, especially on mainstream media, what a lot of politicians on all these different sides love to say out loud. But as always, we're going to have Larry Johnson here to try to pierce through the fog of the nuttiness and the nonsense and try to get to what is actually true on the ground. And as always, welcome back to the show, Larry. Always great to have you on.
That's a new moniker for me. Fog light.
You know what? I mean, it is, Christmas Eve and, one foggy Christmas. I don't know if there's an analogy to be made there, but I hope you can provide that clarity.
Oh, yeah. Well, I should get a picture of my truck. I've got these fog lights on the front of it. They're blinding, absolutely blinding. So that's what we need, some blinding light.
And I think that you're going to provide that today, because you never do shy back from that. And one of the things we love about having you on the show. Let's start about this whole issue here. Now, I'm kind of as a precursor, a lot of issues going back and forth this week about Trump saying that he had to, well, actually back further a bit, started with a 28-point peace plan, then it went to 19 points, and then kind of to 20 points, and then whose points are we even talking about anymore? And then on Monday, President Trump had this an interview with Politico where he had some pretty harsh things to say about Europe. We had the national security strategy, which also had a lot of the harsh things to say about Europe. But now then we're focused on what's going on here. And by the way, Europe was shooting a bunch of stuff back against the United States here. And for anybody who may be interested in that dynamic, you can see our show we had earlier today with Alexander Mercurius, who did a spectacular job really putting a fog light on that. So I don't want to repeat what he said there, but let's get to stuff that actually is really to the point in your area of expertise. And that is kind of what the Russians are saying. A lot of this, we had just a comment earlier today from Sergei Lavrov, who you have met on a number of occasions and talked to. So you have a pretty good insight to maybe when he says something, what does he actually mean? And let's start off with this one here going on where he says, it's actually the Europeans who are pushing back on having a deal at all.
Europe has been holding back this process, instigating the so-called Ukrainian leader, encouraging him to fight till the last Ukrainian. The thing is, they're short of money. And right now, this ideological agenda is being influenced by money concerns, because there's no other way for them other than rip off the Russian Federation and take our gold reserves. They have no other sources of financing this war.
So let's take a number of those things he said in order. First of all, he says that this whole dynamic between the United States, Europe, and Ukraine over coming to some sort of an agreement on this half of the equation, as opposed to the Russian half, which really hasn't changed since, 2021 maybe.
Yeah.
But he said that it's actually the Europeans who seem to be being the stick in the mud. Do you see it that way?
Yeah. Well, in particular, it's Germany, France, United Kingdom. The Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary are opposing them. So, number one, there is no unity within the European Union, within NATO, about what to do next. But you've got the three of the biggest countries in NATO, as far as Europe goes, who are leading the charge to keep the status quo, to keep Ukraine in the fight. Let me just give you some numbers that makes it so fascinating for me. Ukraine, the triumvirate there of Germany, France, UK, combined population of about 220 million. Total combined ground forces for the three is a little shy of 500,000. Yet they're insisting that Ukraine stay in this fight, and Ukraine's population is 1/10. Actually, probably smaller than that. It's 19 million compared to 220 million. So they are, 1/10 the size of the EU, and yet these Europeans want Ukraine to have 800,000 ground forces. And so Ukraine would have a larger army if the European plan goes forward than Germany, France, UK combined. I mean, that's
plus
just
like
the level of
300,000.
insanity. Yeah, yeah. It's just the level of insanity that's at work.
And I think you asked a really pointed question, and I want to say it was a couple of weeks back on the show here, where you said that the pre-war, like before the, in terms of active forces, prior to February 2022, Ukraine had, I want to say, somewhere around 250,000, 250,000 or so
right.
that they had maintained on a relatively steady state for at least the previous 3 or so years. And that was where they were basically paying for with a functioning country and a functioning government, a functioning tax base, et cetera. But based on where they are right now, how is it even theoretically possible for them to almost quadruple or certainly triple what it was pre-war when the country is a shell of itself economically?
Yeah, no, it's not feasible without the West ponying up the money. Now, remember, the Ukrainians did have anywhere between 700 and 900,000 reservists, which they did call up by March, April of 2022. So it did expand. The Ukrainian army then at the outset was roughly around 1 million as the war got kicked off, or the special military operation. But again, where's the money going to come from? It'd be one thing if, again, the Europeans were all doing well economically. The country in the world that has the lowest debt to GDP ratio of all industrial countries is Russia. Whereas the Europeans, particularly the French and the British, they're 100% or greater in terms of debt to GDP ratio. In other words, they're spending more money than they're bringing in, and Germany is close behind. So, and their economy.
And by the way, Germany has just had a new bill that passed to now make it authorized to go into debt to build up its military, which apparently it didn't have before. So they are now going to accelerate their debt to GDP. Congratulations.
Yeah, let's call that the blackjack casino strategy. Hey, I'm down $100,000. Can I borrow another $100,000 so I can keep trying to win? Yeah,
no problem.
The
bank would love to help you out there.
The casino, man, they're more than happy to make that loan because they're going to make money off of it, and you're going to lose. The odds are you will lose, and that's the same for Europe. So, and if one of these days, maybe Martians will land and come across the documents from this era, and they'll be scratching their pointy little heads trying to figure out what the hell were these Germans and Europeans doing. Because it was, last week, the European Union said, yeah, we don't want to buy any more of that inexpensive Russian oil and gas. We want to pay for the most expensive stuff on the planet. But your economies are going into debt, and your growth rate is dramatic. You're barely growing, about 1% or less. Yeah, but, and it's not that their economies have not been suppressed because of a government policy to deliberately put the brakes on. That's what happened in Russia. They had high inflation. They put the brakes on to slow inflation. That policy has worked. It slowed their growth rate to 1.5%. Except, and you get a lot of people in the West saying, "Oh, the Russia's imploding," but during that time period as well, the wages of workers went up 20%. So actually, the wages of workers went up above the rate of inflation. So,
oh wow, didn't know that part of it.
Yeah, so Russia's able to manage. They can slow the economy down, speed it up as they need to, but they're making rational policy decisions. Europe is not. So the effect of paying higher prices for oil and gas makes the industrial sector non-competitive with the rest of the world. So Europe is acting against its own rational interest, and it all boils down to this irrational hatred of Russia.
And that is being manifest. In fact, Emmanuel Macron earlier this week said, number one, we still have a lot of cards to play, so we don't have to give in to what Trump is suggesting by giving up territory to get peace. But then he also repeated a canard that I think is become almost a article of faith in the West that no one questions, unfortunately. And that is that Russia's economy is finally starting to teeter because of all these sanctions. So what we need is another round of sanctions, and that'll get them. What do you say to that?
That is Christopher Walken from Saturday Night Live. More cowbell. That, you know, they don't get it. Russia's is the number one country in the world in terms of natural resources. Number one. Russia, its economic problem. What's its economic problem? It doesn't have enough employees. There's virtual zero unemployment. And you go, wait a second. I think it's usually a bad thing if you got high unemployment. The target is usually to get where everybody who wants a job can get a job. Well, that's Russia. So let me see if I got this straight. If you want a job, you can get a job in Russia. Yeah, there it is. More cowbell. And then number two, your wages are going up. So what's the down? Correct me on the downside here. Well, the stores are full. The restaurants are open. The businesses are well supplied. And here's Europe. It's becoming a trash heap. I mean, these cities are becoming disgusting with homeless and with trash littering the streets in Paris and in London, in contrast to Russia. And yet these Europeans, and it's not just the Europeans, it's Scott Bessent as well, our Secretary of the Treasury, they keep pushing this nonsense that, oh boy, we're just one more little push and Russia's economy is going to implode. They didn't look at what happened to Russia in the 1990s. When the Soviet Union broke up, the economy did implode. You had people who had the best credentials, tremendous experience, who were technical people. They couldn't get jobs. Laborers in factories couldn't get jobs. The people who had jobs were working without pay. They didn't get paid for weeks, sometimes months, including in the military. The death rate for life expectancy for men dropped from like 63 to 56. An estimated 7 million people died above what would normally have been expected from just regular activity. I talked to Matt Taibbi the other day, and he lived there then, and he said, you know, you'd be walking down the street, a main street like Tverskaya Ulitsa, which is a street that runs down into the Kremlin. He said you'd be stepping over bodies. There'd be bodies laying on the sidewalks. Wow. The trash wasn't picked up. Crime was rampant. Women were selling their bodies right and left because they had to feed their families, and selling for sex was at least one of the tried and true old-time professions that could still put some bread on the table. It was, to call it a shithole would be an insult to shitholes. Okay? It was awful. They remember this, and they had two periods of hyperinflation during that time. Yeah, you know, when in my last two trips to Moscow, where I've been interviewing people sponsored by the International Unity Club, I made a point of asking everybody, what was your experience in the 1990s? You didn't hear any happy stories about, oh man, life was great, boy, we were cruising, we were raking. No, the kind of suffering that went on, and yet they kept their soul. So when I hear these Westerners talk about they're going to implode the Russian economy, the Russians have been there. They've done that. They got the damn T-shirt, and they're not going back there. And the economy they have today is much more robust. It's complex, and it is not dependent on the West. That's what's pissing these people off.
Yeah, and you know what? I think, Larry, that's one of the important things that that everybody in the West needs to have a firmer understanding with. And one of the big aggravations I have when you have the Scott Bessents and the Keir Starmers and Emmanuel Macrons, et cetera, making these statements and add merits to that list, is that they never say, okay, I know the first 19 rounds didn't work, but the 20th one will. And here's why. A, B, C. This factor is going to go here. This aspect of the Russian economy is going to be hit by this function, and that's going to knock it down, which is going to have these cascade, et cetera. If you were an economist and you said there is a rational path that this one over the other ones could work, that would be one thing. And then we could assess it. But because that doesn't exist, but because the first 19 basically made Russia say, all right, forget about the West. Let's go over here. So all of our lifelines now exist that beyond your reach. There is no path, and they're not even making one up. They just say it's going to work without having to actually provide any evidence to that. And I mean, it's aggravating just on an academic level. But when you're talking about it's taken another country, the Ukrainian armed forces, into literal oblivion and the destruction of the physical countryside, then it becomes a crime.
Right. Yeah, no, it is. There is no regard in the West for what happens to the people of Ukraine. We've launched war after war, and shown the same attitude towards the people of Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, Somalia, Serbia, Panama. It's a pretty lengthy list. Vietnam. At no point when the West is intervening in the internal affairs of these other countries do we actually get concerned about the welfare of the people, because the people are simply pawns to be used in a broader game of global chess. Only it's a lethal game. This one comes with real bombs, real weapons, but we never pay for the consequences.
And and I think it's even worse than that, Larry. We instead of even acknowledging all the suffering that goes on over there, instead we do almost the opposite, and we use their suffering as justification to do more by saying things like they are so brave and they are fighting for democracy. They're on the front line of the defense of our way of life and all this kind of stuff. And we hold it up as this thing to be prized. And so we continue to do it to keep the sacrifice on the front burner. And then, of course, just like happened in Afghanistan, like happened in Libya and several of these other places, in Iraq, once it's off the front page and we no longer care, then okay, moving on. And then the bodies just pile up on the other side and no one ever goes back to look. And that's another issue I guess we can go into on another day. Let's get back to the focus here.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No, it's thoroughly entitled. We got to keep the money machine going. I mean,
no matter
this
how many
war is
bodies
all
fall.
about making money. And when you've got the number of, General Dynamics, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and others they're raking in the cash. Their shareholders are doing well.
And that's another thing that Sergei Lavrov said, which gives another indication that you understand how he's thinking and stuff, because you said a second ago that a lot of this hatred for Russia is driving a lot of this, in addition to the lust for money. And that's something that Sergei Lavrov mentioned today.
Europe is blindfolded by its desire to deliver strategic defeat to the Russian Federation. Some of them even say in their media interviews that they can't think of a situation when they'll have to swallow the defeat and will have to admit the fact that Russia is reaching its lawful goals. Of course, it's their problems, but they created them for themselves, and they are making them worse, trying to cling on to the absolutely pointless policy.
So that's what Sergei Lavrov said. Is that just a jingoistic kind of view from Russia's trying to put a good picture on stuff, or does he have a point?
No, he's got a definite point. But this goes back 200 years. 1812, Napoleon invaded. Then you had the Brits and the French invading Crimea. Was that 1853, 1854? Then the United States and Britain put troops into what was the birth of the Soviet Union, fighting against the Bolsheviks back in 1919. Then of course we got that little paper hanger painter from Vienna who is leading the 1,000-year Reich, launched Barbarossa in June of 1941. So for Russia to be a little paranoid about its neighbors to the west, because during that entire time, the only time that Russia moved west, well, actually the two times that they moved west, the first time in 1814 they made it all the way to Paris, but they were part of a broader European coalition that was fighting against Napoleon. So they weren't necessarily leading the way, but they marched into Paris and picked up some good champagne in the process. Then in response,
correct me if I'm wrong, but that was only after Moscow had burned, right?
Yeah. That was 2 years after Napoleon had been in Moscow. Moscow burned to the ground, and then the French army essentially got frozen to death in trying to escape Russia. But then in World War II, Russia pushed. They pushed to the west, and they occupied Poland. They occupied the eastern half of West Germany. They occupied Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. for a good reason. They wanted a buffer for themselves. We pretend that that was part of just Russian, the communist imperialism take over the world. No, it was a pragmatic, we want to have a buffer because we just lost 27 million people. And that, again, the West fails to appreciate that. But we layer the Russian movement to the east with our own mythology. See, Russia wants to conquer Europe.
Again, I've heard that phrase.
Yeah,
again,
and it never quote conquered Europe, and it's always been Europe attacking Russia, not the opposite way around. So here we are again, and the Russians are, they're going, as Yogi Berra said, it's deja vu all over again. They're hearing the Germans say, yes, we must build up our army and move to the east. Yeah, how'd that work out the first time?
That's a fact. They physically have done that. They're going to have the biggest the biggest military on the continent, most powerful, and they have physically moved a mechanized brigade all the way up to the Baltics. So it's not rhetoric. There's actually action behind it.
Yeah, and so Russia, look, they remember the Great Patriotic War. We in the United States don't. We barely recall World War II. This year, there's hardly any commemorations on December 7th. It's just faded. It's 84 years since then. Who cares? That's ancient history. Not for the Russians. It's vibrant. It lives with them. Their grandfathers, their grandmothers, their great-grandfathers, their great-grandmothers, they died and suffered in that war. Almost every family in Russia, and still families that are there today, had somebody who made a great sacrifice in that war. And so they don't forget. And that's where the West fails to appreciate the importance of that and how Russia reacts on foreign policy issues.
Now let's look at this from a slightly different perspective here and provide as balanced of an assessment as you can, because there's two similar dynamics playing out on both sides of this conflict here. You have what we just saw from Sergei Lavrov, what we've had when we show Peskov or especially Vladimir Putin. They're very confident. They're very self-confident when they say a lot of these things. Mm-hmm. But for especially the Western audience who's watching, then they also look over to the West and they see equal amounts of confidence. We showed earlier this week some confidence, recent conferences from this weekend from Keir Starmer, especially Emmanuel Macron, who was very confident, very cocky in some of his confidence. Merz was even more so, especially with this big military buildup he has. So for the people, they see two different poles here, and they see both are really confident, if not even cocky here. But are people to understand that, well, there are two equal sides and there's reasons why they both have optimism, or is one side not having a good idea about what they're doing?
Well, I'd recommend that your people watching right now or listening, they go check out Andrei Martyanov's latest video on YouTube, and it's posted at his site at Smoothie X12, where he compares and contrasts the nuclear submarine force of the United Kingdom with that of Russia. And the bottom line there is the UK can't even keep its 2 or 3 boats right now operative. And they're advertising, think about this, they're advertising for somebody to command their submarine fleet because there's nobody currently in that chain of command that they think is worthy or smart enough or capable enough to command it. This is unbelievable.
And Gary, I think you have a headline from the BBC from today, if I'm not mistaken, that talks about the ground forces have an even bigger problem than the naval forces here. We'll see if we can pop that up there. I'm kind of throwing a curveball, but it just looks like that. Number one, the Germans, we'll look at that first because they have moved a brigade over into to Lithuania. But when you look at the overall size of their force, they don't have that many tanks. They don't have that many qualified personnel. Now they want to get up to a bunch, but they are doing something which I think, and maybe you can comment on this. Yeah, that's the one there. I think that's from today. How long could Britain really fight if war broke out tomorrow? According to this author here, it goes down and you look a little further, a few weeks.
Yeah, probably 2 weeks.
A few weeks.
Two to 3 weeks tops.
We know for a fact that the Russian side has a sustainment capacity, and they can go on at current rates of fire and everything else indefinitely. And we certainly also understand, and you can tell me if this is right or wrong from your sources, that Russia in ramping up their defense industrial base is not like taking everything from the factory floor to the front line firing points, but they are actually storing up a substantial payload in many different categories with the expectation or the fear that they may one day have to fight NATO. So they are simultaneously diverting some to storage, building up huge stockpiles, which we are doing the opposite of draining our stockpiles to give things for Ukraine's here. How do you see all that playing out? And how does that factor in?
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, Putin has recently said that next year Russia is going to decrease military spending. They ramped up for the special military operation, but they did not fully mobilize the economy. And the reason they didn't have to fully mobilize the economy is they had enough flexibility and capacity built in that they could rapidly expand production. And the production has been expanded across all weapon systems, whether we're talking the 5th generation fighters, whether we're talking the T-90 tanks, whether we're talking the artillery pieces, the production of ammunition for those are 152 millimeter shells. Drones have become particularly important. In fact, it's not just one type of drone; this is multiple type of drones of similar super production of the Kinshal, the Iskander. Then on top of that, the Oreshnik, which has been used once, but is now being produced at a rate that means they're going to stockpile. I would imagine they'll probably have 100 to 200 by the end of this year. So across the board, Russia's able to build up its forces, and at the same time, they've expanded the ground force.
By the way, let me maybe throw you a curveball. I don't know if you have the knowledge about this. You talked about the Russian in all these categories, one of which was the drones, and according to published sources, Russia's somewhere around in the production rate of around 2 million per year in FPV drones and a couple of other categories. There was also last week an article in the U.S. military that we're hoping to get up to 300,000 by 2027. So that's what the U.S. is doing. And Hegseth is apparently bragging on how we're cutting edge and modernizing and all that kind of stuff. Do you have any idea what the European production level is? Because they've been trying to expand all this for a long time. Do you know how many they're producing of drones, that whether it goes to Ukraine or they keep it? Do you know what those are?
No, I don't. I don't have any current figures on it. But all I do know is that instead of building up and expanding the job market, instead of saying, hey, boy, we got all these factory jobs, we need to employ a bunch of people, Europeans are doing the exact opposite. They're shedding jobs and factories are moving overseas. So we're not seeing the industrial base being galvanized for this level of production.
Okay, so let me ask you a related question to the extent that you know. You said a second ago that Russia has not a full mobilization of its industrial base, but it is a special military, a partial. So it's at the level that it's at right now. We know that. But you said that they could go to a full mobilization, which they would mobilize the reserve folks. And you said there could be anywhere between 3 and 10 million, depending on who you want to listen to. But the bottom number is pretty high. Then the question is, how long would it take, as far as you know, to go from this partial mobilization to a full wartime mobilization if Russia needed to? Do you have any sense?
Probably 3 months. I mean,
that's pretty short.
Yeah. No,
is that because that they have been saying, all right, let's make preliminary actions in factories across the board, that if we had to go up to, what's your action plan? Or is it just that they've always made it like that?
They've planned for it. So the general staff they have plans for that contingency. As you'd correctly noted, that in the 2022 start of the special military operation, the general staff then basically had plan A and didn't have a good plan B in place. And then after the collapse of the peace talks in Istanbul, and then the decision of the Ukrainians to fully mobilize and to go to war, that Russia scrambled to come up with plan B and plan C, which they have now been executing. But with respect to what the scenario you're laying out, they've got a plan for. That's why it's not just wordplay when they call it a special military operation, it's a genuine expression that, hey, this is, we're not fully mobilized. And
yeah, actually, Putin said that last week, if I'm not mistaken. We played that soundbite a couple of times where he expressly said, we've been doing surgical kinds of things. You may remember him doing this. He said, but we could go on a full mobilization if we needed to. So now then the question is, and again, I may be asking you something you don't have the access to, but what is your appreciation anyway for what the Western side has done, and what is its capability? If we had to go to a full mobilization, how long would it take to get the industrial up to something close to being a par with the Russians?
I think we are militarily weaker today than we were in 2002, 2003. I know in 2002, one of my friends, she was actually part of the office at the Pentagon that was involved with, the tip fiddle, the phased deployment of troops. And I knew when she began starting to call up units and how that process worked. Back then, it took us at least 6 months. At least 6 months.
And if I can just interject here, I was working in the Pentagon on issues with tip fiddle related to the 2003 war. So I can validate exactly what you're saying right there. A lot of these things we had to start in 2002 to get everything ready to flow in 2003. And that's of stuff that we already had. That's not mobilized in anything and adding to the defense industrial base. That's just the existing base. And it took that long to get things ready.
Yeah. In fact, when there was a request that came out of Delta Force. So there's a book written by his pen name Dalton Fury. He unfortunately, Tom Greer is his name. He's since unfortunately passed way too young from cancer. But he was one of the officers on the ground there trying to capture bin Laden, and they specifically requested that the 75th Rangers be deployed as a blocking force to help them try to contain and get it. And that order was turned down by Tommy Franks and by Secretary of Defense Cheney and by others in the chain of command, others up in the political chain of command up to Bush. And the reason was they were getting ready to go to Iraq. They saw this as a distraction. So really the actual planning to go into Iraq started December of 2001. And then it started accelerating, and then they started doing the initial movement of troops and calling troops up.
And by the way, if anybody is thinking that Larry is exaggerating here, we have literal video proof from General Wes Clark, who said 1 week after 9/11, he was told that the Pentagon was already preparing for an Iraq war, and then after that, an Iran war. So this is not conjecture. This is historical record stuff.
Yeah. You and I are both old enough. We lived through it. We know what we saw, know what we heard at the time. And so the West is not, we're weaker now. We've got we've got a reserve force that's pretty stressed as a result of the last 25 years. We relied heavily on reservists to staff up in places like Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq. So they've suffered some significant stress out of that. But now to have to call together a force to potentially confront Russia, while we've only got 18,000 troops mobilized right now for Venezuela. And let me give you some other numbers. So Venezuela is 3 times larger in terms of land size, almost 3 times larger in land size than is Vietnam. In Vietnam, at the height of our deployment and engagement there in April of 1969, we had 543,000 troops. You realize we had more troops in Vietnam then than we have in the entire U.S. Army today. U.S. Army today is about 470,000. So we'd need another, 70, 80,000 just to match what we had in Vietnam. And back then we had troops also in Europe and in South Korea and in other places in the world. So we're not even at the strength level we were then. And we're going to call up so that just tells me.
Well, and I want to take the personnel issue separately.
Yeah.
I want to look at the defense industrial base, because Russia was caught flat-footed, as you said, from plan A to resourcing plan B, and it took them a good year and a half, 2 years, depending on how you want to count it, to where they were really like, okay, now we're in pretty good shape here. So how long? Let's just say that it doesn't matter how, but let's just hypothetically say that who was it? The French say, you know what? I'm tired of messing with this. We're going to send the French army into there, and we're going to join in. Bam! All of a sudden, we're at war. Article 5, everything. And now then there is a conflict, a conventional conflict between Russia and NATO. So from that day, how long will it take the defense industrial base to get up to where it's close to a par with the Russian defense industrial base?
I don't think it can, because it's dependent upon imports from places like China. And China's not going to export rare earth minerals to Europe and the United States that are going to be used to try to destroy its economic, military, and political partner, Russia. Not going to happen. So again, the West suffers from a shortage of critical minerals, critical resources that are essential to produce weapons and weapon systems.
But then there's also the issue of, correct me if I'm wrong, the physical infrastructure. Even if you got that part of the equation solved, and you got all the China said, you know what, I don't even like Russia anymore. Here's everything that you need. We don't have the physical factories,
right,
the trained workforce to do a radical expansion. And we've offloaded so much of that, or offshore rather, so much of it elsewhere into Asia, et cetera, that to try and recreate it from the ground it would just take, I mean, you have to train a workforce and get the money and build it, all the while with, you just mentioned it, with the Oreshnik and some of these other conventional weapons. There's not that many factories around, and they would all have a target on their back, wouldn't they?
Yeah, no, absolutely. If you go to Iowa and Illinois, in the area called the Quad Cities, near Galesburg, Illinois, 30 years ago, you were actually producing John Deere tractors there. They were being built there, and the parts were being made there. Today, those parts and critical parts are being made overseas and other places, Mexico in particular. Then they have to be shipped back into the United States, and they still do some assembly there in Iowa, in the Iowa plant. But the point of the fact is that across the board, whether through the Rust Belt, Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, steel mills that used to be, centers of employment and anchors for financial securities of those communities, they're gone. We become a service industry. So it just saying, okay, it's not like what happened during the Depression at the start of World War II. We had the infrastructure for factories was in place. And at that point, man, it was flipping the switch. Hey, anybody out there want a job? By God, the people came flooding in. And
we had a lot of factories, and you could literally transition them from producing this kind of widget to that kind of military widget. I mean, isn't that correct?
Yeah, they stopped. So Ford stopped making cars that people could buy for, to drive around the countryside. And they started making Jeeps and trucks and tanks. And the same assembly line principles that made the Ford process so famous was then turned on, and man, it was churning out not just the land vehicles, but airplanes.
Yeah,
same. I mean, we saw the same with how many aircraft carriers they've built in a period of 2 years.
Yeah, it was stunning.
And now it takes us like 3 years to build just one aircraft carrier.
Yeah, if you can get it done there, and usually there's cost overruns and everything else.
Yeah.
So what that does, though, that tells me, we circle back around to the conflict. You have the Russians over on this side being very confident. You have the Ukrainians and the Europeans being very confident. Who's justified to be confident here, Larry?
Oh, well, Russia is, the West isn't.
I mean, you just painted the picture. I kind of cheated a little bit there.
No, that's all right. Cheating's okay.
Okay, now then the biggest question. What is the ramifications of those realities, the on the ground, on the factory realities, the capacity with each side to do it? What happens if you get one side cocky and confident, but they don't have the ability to back it up? Where does it lead?
Disaster for the Ukrainians. Russia has made it clear, hey, we're willing to make a deal, but we are going to dictate the terms of the deal because we're not over the barrel, we're not backed into a corner, we're not desperate to bring this to an end. And the essence of the current deal that's on the table is Crimea, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, Luhansk. Those must be recognized by the international community as permanent parts of Russia. Ukraine does not get to keep hold of those. In addition, there has to be genuine new elections in Ukraine to replace this government that is comprised of neo-Nazis and Bandera loyalists. NATO has to get out of Ukraine and end all association and relationship with Ukraine. Those are sort of the three fundamental demands of Russia, and they're not going to back off of those at all. So if Ukraine refuses, no, we're not going to accept that. You can't make us. Russia goes, okay, then we're going to continue the war. The next deal that will be on the table is that Russia is going to take Dnipropetrovsk. They're going to finish pushing to the Dnieper River, consolidate their control over Zaporizhia. They will then take Dnipropetrovsk, which is the oblast just north of Zaporizhia. They'll also take Poltava and Sumy and Kharkiv. Kharkiv is just north of Luhansk, and then Sumy, and then Poltava. And to the south, Nikolaev, and then Odessa. Russia's going to keep moving militarily. They will. In fact, I think there's been another attack on one of the ghost ships in the Black Sea.
Yeah.
So I anticipate Russia will now close and embargo the entire southern coast of Ukraine. Ukraine will no longer have access to the Black Sea. I think that'll probably come into place in the next couple of weeks. And then all of a sudden, Ukraine's cut off. They will have no way out. And it's not like the West is in a situation, and the Europeans in particular have enormous wealth that they said, don't worry, buddy, I got your back. It's one thing if Elon Musk comes and tells you, Danny, do whatever you need to do, I'll cover your expenses. Yeah, you'd have a pretty good idea. I think Elon Musk could afford that. He's now the wealthiest man in the world.
Yeah.
But,
do you have his email address, by the way? Because maybe I could ask him.
But the guy that's just gone bankrupt comes to you and said, Danny, hey man, go ahead, do whatever you need to do. I got your back. You're going to go, with what?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to be risking that.
Yeah,
and yet in that absurd analogy that you just gave there, that's exactly what we're doing. We're taking the guy who's bankrupt, and then we're talking about Zelensky here. And I don't want to spend too much more time on this because I want to get another topic before we let you go here. But that's what Zelensky is doing. He's listening to the European guys who are talking with all this confidence without the requisite ability and capacity behind them. And when Trump is saying you need to have elections and you need to take this deal and give up this land in order to get a deal to end this war, and Zelensky in almost consecutive days says, yeah, pound sand ain't giving away nothing. And by the way, yeah, sure, I'll do an election just as soon as you give me the unconditional ceasefire I've been asking. And then after 2 or 3 months, then we'll have an election. Yeah, go ahead and make that happen. And Russia has the exact response that you would think. In fact, Gary, if you could play that one by Peskov real quick, here's how he replied.
We haven't had time to discuss it with anyone. This statement is quite new. This is something that President Putin has been talking about for a long time. It's something that President Trump spoke about just recently. First of all, I'll leave some nuances aside, but we're working on peace, not a ceasefire. A sustainable, guaranteed long-term peace, achieved through the signing of relevant documents, is an absolute priority.
I mean, that has the date on it of today, December the 10th, but I could have put the one on from March the 10th or February the 3rd or whatever, any other day. They've never said anything less, and yet Zelensky just seems to say, I don't care. I'm going to go down this path. And I guess he can do that for a period of time, Larry, but I mean, that has an expiration date, don't you think?
Yeah, well, that's what happens on the ground. We saw that. Well, okay, I saw it. You didn't because you were on the ground. But in 2003, as we're rolling into Baghdad, you had Baghdad Bob insisting, no, U.S. tanks. And, the news media is showing the tanks, it's probably there's Danny Davis waving, hey, Baghdad, here I am. But they persisted with this delusion until, reality came crashing in. And, Russia right now is moving with a confidence. I spoke with another, I was interviewed actually by another one of the Russian, he was a famous Russian sniper, a guy named Decky. And actually, I was asking about the start of the war. He was complaining that, frankly, he thought that the politicians had tied their hands too much, that Putin was so keen on avoiding both civilian casualties on the Ukrainian side and Russian casualties that they moved very cautiously. And he was sort of chafing at that. I found that interesting. But, the Russians, they're firing on all cylinders. They're not under the kind of pressure that, the West pretends, oh, if we just start launching missiles and hitting some of their oil refineries deep into Russia, man, that'll put them on their knees. When you look at the amount of missiles that Russia has fired into Ukraine over the last 42 months, the number of fabs, bombs that have been dropped, the number of drones that have been attacked, it has damaged, it's hurt Ukraine, but it hasn't forced Ukraine to surrender. Are these people arguing that they could match, Ukraine could actually do in the next 2 months what Russia has done over the period of 42 months? No, it's not even possible, not even in the realm of capability. So why would that pinprick from the West cause Russia to, curl into a fetal position and start crying, while, it hasn't had that effect on the Ukrainians? So,
Yeah.
It's just people need to wake up and say, okay, let's try to be rational about this and look at what can be accomplished. It goes back to the likes of Curtis LeMay in World War II. They really believed that all we got to do is drop enough bombs, man, and the Germans would surrender. Nope. Got to bring in those boys, the Danny Davis's tanks. That's what it takes, with some infantry.
Yeah, it didn't work then. Didn't work in Korean War when he tried the same thing and literally wiped out almost every city of any size, and that still didn't bring them to their knees.
Right,
But
right.
we can talk about that another time. All right, listen, in the amount of time we got left, though, I want to shift gears here back into our hemisphere because a lot of things are going on with the Venezuela situation here. And first of all, I just want to kind of get your updated view on whether you think that there is going to be, what is the chances of the likelihood of an actual attack with all this combat power the U.S. has had in the region now for many weeks?
I think it's, I'd give it a 60% chance that we'll try to bomb something. It'll be ineffective. We'll kill some Venezuelans and we'll make a show of force and then declare victory. We do not have enough troops in the entire U.S. military, including reservists, right now, to do anything in Venezuela of any consequence other than getting U.S. soldiers killed and killing some Venezuelan civilians. The average American just does not understand how big, as I mentioned earlier, that Venezuela is 3 times the size of Vietnam. And in Vietnam, we had more than 500,000 soldiers on the ground there and still failed to defeat the North Vietnamese. And I don't want to hear from these guys, oh, we just weren't trying, or we were betrayed by our politicians. Oh, nonsense. We lost. We need to get used to it. So we haven't, we got like 18,000 now to go into Venezuela. I can't imagine that there's anybody at the Pentagon or the Department of War stupid enough to go along with an order to deploy U.S. ground forces. Now, are there some special operations forces running around trying to create mayhem? Yeah, probably. But again, they're not decisive. It wasn't the special operations executive of the Brits in World War II that won World War II. It was guys named Zhukov in Russia that entered Berlin and destroyed and defeated the German army. It was ground troops, massive troops. And, that's always accompanied by losses. So, I think what the United States has been trying to do is to provoke a reaction from Maduro. And so far, he's not taken the bait. And I saw this before, Danny, back in 1988, when we were trying to provoke Manuel Noriega into doing something so that we could then justify invading Panama. And that effort started a year before. I think our invasion underwent and started in December of '88. But it was in my branch, Central America branch, and the analyst who had the account, Alyssa, she was constantly meeting with the folks in the Directorate of Operations, and she was being apprised of what uh, actions we were taking, what we were trying to do in order to provoke Noriega. Noriega didn't take the bait, and so
Well,
far,
you speaking of taking the bait, that headline Gary's showing right there, to me, this was an attempt to get Maduro to take the bait. We had 2 military fighter jets for 40 minutes flying through the airspace of Venezuela, not in the ADIZ, not near it, not in their territorial or off their territorial waters, but actually in their airspace for 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Which, of course, if that ever happened to us, we would be going crazy and we'd be shooting them down, etc. We'd be, especially if it was like a Chinese or a Russian. I mean, we'd be losing our minds. But yet here we are without even a second thought, and no one even bats an eyelash that I've seen about us sending our fighter aircraft into their airspace of another sovereign country with no justification at all. That by itself is a problem. But I almost wonder, and you can give me your view, I almost wonder if we weren't hoping that they would have been attacked.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. This is a play. We've run this playbook many times, and we're like that bully in the bar, and he'll be up and he'll keep finger poking you until you throw a punch, and then he'll say, "Hey, I wasn't doing anything. He hit me." That's what we're doing. It's an old tactic, but Maduro, I think, is he's talking to the Russians, he's talking to the Chinese, he's talking to the Iranians, he's trying to talk to other neighbors like the president of Colombia. I suspect he's talking to Lula in Brazil as well. He's not going to take the bait, and instead they're making quiet preparations. If we're foolish enough to put troops in there on the ground, we'll have more people killed in Venezuela than we had killed in Iraq.
But aren't we setting ourselves up for real trouble here with that last headline that Gary showed there? And that was also part of something that Trump said in that Politico interview earlier this week, where he said Maduro's days are numbered. So he said, I'm not going to tell you what we're going to do operational. And he insulted the reporter. But then he said, but yeah, his days are numbered. So Trump is kind of putting himself in a position, and I'd like your view on this particular point here too, that he's putting himself in a no-win situation. If he doesn't do anything, if he doesn't have any kind of attack after having all of that combat power, which continues to rise up, and as you said, now it's around 18,000 total personnel and all these ships and Marines and everything else, and making that statement, but then Maduro's days don't get numbered and they just keep on rolling on, and then we end up leaving. I mean, Trump's going to look pretty weak, and I fear, and what's your view on this, that Trump may go, well, I can't have that. I can't have this clown Maduro who's out doing Trump-like dances in front of everybody and mocking him, etc., and then succeeding, and then nothing ever happens, and we literally just leave and go home. I worry that we may have to say, well, we got to do something, and then what happens after that?
Well, we started deploying our troops and these naval fleets into the Venezuela AOR in August. So let's just do the math. September, October, November. We're more than 3.5-4 months into this. Now we're into December, almost halfway through December. And what have we accomplished? Well, we've accomplished putting ships out there that are costing a lot of money each day, and putting a stress on the crews because they're not, they're asking them to be ready, but nothing's happening. We don't have enough, 18,000 sounds like a lot. It's a pittance.
Yeah, because a lot of that's naval craft. It's not even ground troops that even could do something. So it's a really small number of actual deployable ground troops.
Right. And there's the ability of Venezuelan military and paramilitaries to carry out ambushes on any U.S. forces that get on the ground. It's not like Iraq, where at least in Iraq, you could see for miles in some direction. It was tough to hide,
Yes, I can verify that.
Yeah, not Venezuela. Venezuela's got a lot of jungle.
which you can
And
verify because you've been in that
I've
area. You know the territory.
been there, done it, got the T-shirt. And I've been to Caracas, I've been to Barquisimeto, I've been down south in Venezuela. So,
Well, now let me ask you one other question here, because I know we're getting low on time here, but there's something that you have a kind of a unique knowledge about that is mostly not even on anyone's radar in the public. They're just talking about whether there's going to be action or not. But you say that there's an issue between the internal dynamics, between the command relationships of the various forces. And can you tell us a little bit about that and how that might impact what's going on?
yeah, so within the U.S. military, there's a concept called the supported commander and the supporting commander. So the way the U.S. has the world divided up into regions, this particular region falls under the command of SOUTHCOM, Southern Command. Southern Command is now headquartered in Miami, Florida. It used to be headquartered at Quarry Heights in Panama. Well, we're out of Panama now, so we're operating out of Miami. And in theory, the commander of Southern Command is the one who should be directing all the operations. And then JSOC, which falls on, so Joint Special Operations Command, which falls under Special Operations Command, SOCOM. So you got to learn, if you're going to play military analyst, got to learn all the acronyms. SOCOM, JSOC's under it. JSOC is the one that has the tip of the spear, the tier 1 units, Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, Task Force 160, the helicopter guys. Then you get to the tier 2 elements like Rangers, 75th Rangers. So in this case, so normally you would have Southern Command in charge, dealing directly with the Pentagon, and then JSOC supporting Southern Command. So the Southern Command general would be issuing the orders through what JSOC would do and not do. Instead, what we have, JSOC or SOCOM is sitting on top with the JSOC commander, Bradley. I'm not sure who the current commander is at JSOC, but it's a 2-star general. And so JSOC's calling the shots. It's Southern Command that has to provide the support to JSOC. Now, I did the exercises in this arena over 23 years, and you talk about some battles, particularly if you had to have JSOC operating in an AOR where there was CENTCOM and AFRICOM came together. Oh man, Clash of the Titans, because you get bureaucratic battles and every general like, hey, I'm in charge, I'm important. So you got a little bit of that going on right now, and with the issues surrounding the murder of civilians without justification. Now, I had a good friend, dear friend, who's a Navy SEAL, retired commander. He sent me all the legal justification, because these aren't, since they're not flying a flag of a particular nation, they're not entitled to any kind of protection. But the issue is that we're not talking about pirates here. We're talking about us killing unarmed civilians. So unless those people are threatening us or firing weapons at us, showing a firearm threatening to kill us, we've got no justification to kill civilians. That's a war crime. That is the war crime.
I agree. Yeah. The double tap is its own issue here, but that's why I've been arguing from the beginning. The first tap is I think it could very well be a war crime, but
yeah,
we don't seem to be looking at that.
Yeah. So this whole bureaucratic battle within the military itself, between who's in charge right now, SOCOM's in charge and Southern Command is supporting. And frankly, that may have been one of the issues that led to the resignation of Halsey, who was the Southcom commander. That could be one of the issues that factored in. He goes, I'm not going to be a strap hanger on this circus. I get to be the ringmaster, or I'm not going to do it. That could have been a reason.
Right. So let's ask you in a different question here in the last few minutes you have. What impact could this issue, where all the focus is upon war crimes and who gave this order and was it justified, on just the boats out here? But what if you get a situation to where now then we're called to actually attack another country, which, according to the Constitution, requires a congressional declaration of war first, or if it's the 1973 War Powers Act, it either requires congressional authorization or an attack by that country against us. Otherwise, it's an illegal act. Is there any risk that it could cause some hesitation amongst some of the commanders because they're going, I don't want to end up on some kind of a court docket after this is over? Could that come into play anywhere?
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, that's what when the first Washington Post article came out on this, and Hegseth and Trump were just, reacting with great disdain. Oh, this, just a loser Washington Post. What struck me was the number of sources within the military, within the Pentagon, within the Department of War that were talking. And basically they're saying, no. You're not hanging this on us. This was your call. And self-preservation kicks in. You've got that. Then the other issue is limited resources of the United States. We're not. This is what got me fired as a Fox News analyst back in November of 2002. I said the United States at that time was not capable of fighting a two-front war, and that if we were going to go into Iraq, we would be sacrificing going after bin Laden. Well, I think I was right, proven right by subsequent details. Well, I guarantee you right now, we have zero capability to engage Venezuela and then engage the Russians in Ukraine and possibly throw in the Iranians on, for dessert. I mean, and what about China? Oh yeah, we're so overstretched that so we're not sure what our priorities are.
Well, there's a whole lot of that going to, and I wish we had more time because I'd love to actually talk to you about the national security strategy. Speaking of that, not really having an idea where we're going, hopefully we can have you back on real quick to talk about that. But thanks so much for coming on today. This has been very, very enlightening and interesting. Thank you very much.
Most welcome, sir.
Always our pleasure for having you on, and appreciate you guys too. As a quick reminder, we are on Apple Podcasts, really anywhere you get your podcast. Type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you'll find us waiting there for you. Be sure and share this with folks too, or on danieldavisdeepdive.substack.com. Make sure you send this out to anybody else. We are unintimidated and uncompromised to give you the truth, and we need you guys to help us spread that truth to other people in ways that they can get their information they like it. We have a little bit of something for everybody. Thanks very much, folks, and we'll see you on the next episode tomorrow of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.